Good morning and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I'm your host, Bo Heckman. Today we are just about wrapping up the chilling tale of Rebecca. There's a lot going on right now. And to inform us is our guest reader, Amy. Amy, how are you doing today?
I am fantastic. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. A little tired, but hanging in there. What is going on, Rebecca? It seems like the S has hit the fan. So just everything.
Yeah, well, it's like I was saying at the end of the last one. I thought that when we got Maxim's confession, that would be it. But no. Oh no, there's more. There's so much more. So now we have Favel saying, I have a note, and then they called in the colonel to, I think, make Favel out to be kind of an idiot, and that's working. So like I said, I thought we were just going to coast to the last page. No. We got 40 pages left, and I'm sure we have a lot still to discover. So we'll see.
So everybody hang on. You're still going for quite a ride.
I know. Yes. Catherine knows. Miss James has been with us this whole time.
And she says, good morning. How is everyone this morning? I can't believe we're so close to the end.
I know.
Well, that just means we'll have to bring Amy back very, very soon with more stories to tell.
Not complaining. I'd love it.
Put that out there as a teaser. So without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Amy, and take us away into Rebecca.
Fantastic. All right, everyone. This is probably the big conclusion. This is the version I am reading from, for those of you who are joining, because all you wanted to do was see how it ends. Totally understand that. I'm mostly excited and a little sad because I love hanging out with all of you virtually for the last couple of months. But also I'm excited because now I can watch the new film, and I'll be really ready for that. So without moving any slower, hopefully we'll get to it through the end. If for some reason we don't, we'll just meet quickly on the next time and do it then and read and talk and do all that stuff. So we're on chapter 24. Off we go. Thank God for Favel's laugh. Thank God for his pointing finger, his flushed face, his staring, bloodshot eyes. Thank God for the way he stood there swaying on his 2 feet, because it made Colonel Julian antagonistic. It put him on our side. I saw the disgust in his face and a quick movement of his lips. Colonel Julian did not believe him. Colonel Julian was on our side. The man's drunk, he said quietly. He doesn't know what he's saying. Drunk am I? Shouted Flavel. Oh, no, my fine friend. You may be a magistrate and a colonel into the bargain, but it won't cut any ice with me. I've got the law on my side for a change, and I'm going to use it. There are other magistrates in this bloody county besides you, fellows with brains in their heads who understand the meaning of justice, not soldiers who got the sack years ago for incompetence and walk around with a string of putty medals on their chest. Max de Winter murdered Rebecca, and I'm going to prove it. Wait a minute, Mr. Favel, said Colonel Julian quietly. You were present at the inquiry this afternoon, weren't you? I remember you now. I saw you sitting there. If you felt so deeply about the injustice of the verdict, why didn't you say so then to the jury, to the coroner himself? Why didn't you produce that letter in court? Favel stared at him and laughed. Why? He said. Because I did not choose to, that's why. I preferred to come and tackle De Winter personally. That's why I rang you up, said Maxim, coming forward from the window. We've already heard Flavel's accusations. I asked him the same question. Why didn't he tell his suspicion to the coroner? He said he was not a rich man, and that if I cared to settle 2,000 or 3,000 on him for life, he would never worry me again. Frank was here, and my wife. They both heard him ask them. It's perfectly true, sir, said Frank. It's blackmail, pure and simple. Yes, of course, said Colonel Julian. The trouble is that blackmail is not very pure, nor is it particularly simple. It can make a lot of unpleasantness for a great many people, even if the blackmailer finds himself in jail at the end of it. Sometimes innocent people find themselves in jail as well. We want to avoid that, in this case. I don't know whether you are sufficiently sober, Favel, to answer my questions, and if you keep off irrelevant personalities, we may get through with the business quicker. You have just made a serious accusation against De Winter. Have you any proof to back that accusation?" "Proof?" said Flavel. "What the hell do you want with proof? Aren't those holes in the boat enough proof?" "Witness be damned," said Lavelle. "Of course De Winter did it. Who else would kill Rebecca?" "Carith has a large population," said Colonel Julian. "Why not go from door to door, making inquiries? I might have done it myself. You appear to have no more proof against De Winter than you would have against me." "Oh, I see," said Flavel. "You're going to hold his hand through this. You're going to back De Winter. You won't let him down because you've dined with him and he's dined with you. He's a big name down here. He's the owner of Manderley. You poor bloody little snob." "Take care, Flavel, take care." "You think you can get the better of me, don't you? You think I've got no case to bring to a court of law. I'll get my proof for you all right. I tell you, De Winter killed Rebecca because of me. He knew I was her lover. He knew I was jealous. He was jealous, madly jealous. He knew she was waiting for me at the cottage on the beach, and he went down that night and killed her. Then he put her body in the boat and sank her." "Quite a clever story, Flavel, in its way, but I repeat again, you have no proof. Produce your witness who saw it happen, and I might begin to take you seriously. I know that cottage on the beach, a sort of picnic place, isn't it? Mrs. De Winter used to keep her gear there for the boat. It would help your story if you could turn it into a bungalow with 50 replicas inside of it. There would be a chance then that one of the inhabitants might have seen the whole affair." "Hold on," said Flavel slowly. "Hold on. There is a chance De Winter might have been seen that night. Quite a good chance, too. It's worth finding out. What would you say if I did produce witnesses?" "Oh, yes. Yes, hello to the kitty cat. His name is Edgar." And I agree with you. Flavel is painting a very interesting and true story. So let's see if he can talk his way into actually making them believe it. "What would you say if I did produce a witness?" Colonel Julian shrugged his shoulders. I saw Frank glance inquiringly at Maxim. Maxim did not say anything. He was watching Flavel. I suddenly knew what Flavel meant. I knew who he was talking about. And in a flash of fear and horror, I knew that he was right. There had been a witness that night. Little sentences came back to me, words I did not understand. I had not understood, phrases I believed to be the fragments of a poor idiot's mind. "She's down there, isn't she? She won't come back again. I didn't tell no one. They'll find her there, won't they? The fishes have eaten her, haven't they? She'll not come back no more." Ben knew. Ben had seen. Ben, with his queer, crazed brain, had been a witness all the time. He had been hiding in the woods that night. He had seen Maxim take the boat from the moorings and pull back in the dinghy alone. I knew all the color was draining away from my face, and I leant back against the cushion of the chair. "There's a local half-wit who spends his time on the beach," said Flavel. "He was always hanging about when I used to come down and meet Rebecca. I've often seen him. He used to sleep in the woods or on the beach when the nights were hot. Fellow's cracked. He would never have come forward on his own. But I could make him talk if he did see anything that night, and there's a bloody big chance he did." "Who is this? Who is he talking about?" said Colonel Julian. "He must mean Ben," said Frank with another glance at Maxim. "He's the son of one of our tenants. But the man's not responsible for what he says or does. He's been an idiot since birth." "What the hell does that matter?" said Flavel. "He's got eyes, hasn't he? He knows what he sees. He's only got to answer yes or no. You're getting windy now, aren't you? Not so mighty confident." "Can we get a hold of this fellow and question him?" asked Colonel Julian. "Of course," said Maxim. "Tell Robert to cut down to his mother's cottage, Frank, and bring him back." Frank hesitated. I saw him glance at me out of the tail of his eye. "Go on, for God's sake," said Maxim. "We want to end this thing, don't we?" Frank went out of the room, and I began to feel the old nagging pain beneath my heart. In a few minutes, Frank came back again into the room. "Robert's taken my car," he said. "If Ben is at home, he won't be more than 10 minutes. "The rain will keep him home all night," said Flavel. "He'll be there, and I think you'll find I shall be able to make him talk. He laughed and looked at Maxim. His face was still very flushed. Excitement had made him sweat, and there were beads of perspiration on his forehead. I noticed how his neck bulged over the back of his collar and how low his ears were set on his head. Those florid good looks would not last him very long. Already he was out of condition, puffy, and he helped himself to another cigarette. "You're like a little trades union here at Manderley, aren't you?" he said. "No one going to give that else away. Even the local magistrate is in the same racket. We must exempt the bride, of course. A wife doesn't give evidence against her husband. Crawley, of course, has been squandered. He knows he would lose his job if he told the truth. And if I guess rightly, there's a splice of malice in his soul towards me, too. You didn't have much success with Rebecca, did you, Crawley? That garden path isn't quite long enough, eh? It's a bit easier this time, isn't it? The bride will be grateful for your fraternal arm every time she faints. When she hears the judge sentence her husband to death, that arm of yours will come in very handy." It happened very quickly, too quick for me to see how Maxim did it. But I saw Flavel stagger and fall against the arm of the sofa and down to the floor, and Maxim was standing just beside him. I felt rather sick. There was something degrading in the fact that Maxim had hit Flavel, and I wish I had not known. I wish I had not been there to see. Colonel Julien did not say anything. He looked very grim. He turned his back on them and came and stood beside me. "I think you'd better go upstairs," he said quietly. I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "No." "That fellow is in a state capable of anything," he said. "What you have just seen is not very attractive, was it? Your husband is right, of course, but it is a pity you saw it." I did not answer. I was watching Flavel, who was getting slowly to his feet. He sat down heavily on the sofa and put his handkerchief to his face. "Get me a drink," he said. "Get me a drink." Maxim looked at Frank. Frank went out of the room. None of us spoke. In a moment, Frank came back with the whiskey and soda on a tray. He mixed some in a glass and gave it to Flavel. Flavel drank it greedily, like an animal. There was something sensual and horrible about the way he put his mouth to the glass. His lips folded around the glass in a peculiar way. There was a dark red patch on his jaw where Maxim had hit him. Maxim had turned his back to him again and returned to the window. I glanced at Colonel Julien and saw that he was looking at Maxim. His gaze was curious, intent. My heart began beating very quickly. Why did Colonel Julien look at Maxim in that way? Did it mean that he was beginning to wonder, to suspect? Maxim did not see. He was watching the rain. It fell straight and steady as before, and the sound filled the room. Flavel finished his whiskey and soda and put the glass back on the table beside the sofa. He was breathing heavily. He did not look at any of us. He was staring straight in front of him at the floor. The telephone began ringing in the little room. It struck a shrill, discordant note. Frank went to answer it. He came back at once and looked at Colonel Julien. "It's your daughter," he said. "They want to know if they are to keep dinner back." Colonel Julien waved his hand impatiently. "Tell them to start. Tell them I don't know when I shall be back." He glanced, looking at his watch. "Fancy ringing up," he muttered. "What a moment to choose." Frank went back into the little room to give the message. I thought of the daughter at the other end of the telephone. It would be the one who played golf, and I can imagine her calling her sister. "Dad says we're to start. What on earth can he be doing? The steak will be like leather." Their little household disorganized because of us. Their evening routine upset. All these foolish, inconsequent threads hanging upon one another because Maxim had killed Rebecca. I looked at Frank. His face was pale and set. "I heard Robert coming back with the car," he said to Colonel Julien. "The window in there looks out onto the drive." He went out of the library to the hall. Flavel had lifted his head when he spoke. Then he got to his feet once more and stood looking towards the door. There was a queer, ugly smile on his face. The door opened and Frank came in. He turned and spoke to someone in the hall outside. "All right, Ben," he said quietly. "Mr. De Winter wants to give you some cigarettes. There's nothing to be afraid of." Ben stepped awkwardly into the room. He had his sou'wester in his hands. He looked odd and naked without his hat. I realized for the first time that his head was shaved all over and he had no hair. He looked different, dreadful. The light seemed to daze him. He glanced foolishly around the room, blinking his small eyes. He caught sight of me, and I gave him a weak, rather tremulous smile. I don't know if he recognized me or not. He just blinked his eyes. Then Flavel walked slowly toward him and stood in front of him. "Hello," he said. "How's life treated you since we last met?" Ben stared at him. There was no recognition on his face. He did not answer. "Well," said Flavel, "you know who I am, don't you?" Ben went on twisting his sou'wester. "Eh?" he said. "Have a cigarette," said Flavel, handing him the box. Ben glanced at Maxim and Frank. "All right," said Maxim. "Take as many as you like." Ben took 4 and stuck 2 behind each ear. Then he stood, twisting his cap again. "You know who I am, don't you?" repeated Flavel. Still Ben did not answer. Colonel Julien walked across to him. "You shall go home in a few minutes, Ben," he said. "No one is going to hurt you. We just want you to answer 1 or 2 questions. You know Mr. Flavel, don't you?" This time Ben shook his head. "I never seen un," he said. "Don't be a bloody fool," said Flavel roughly. "You know you've seen me. You've seen me go to the cottage on the beach, Mrs. De Winter's cottage. You've seen me there, haven't you?" "No," said Ben. "I never seen no one." "You damn half-witted liar," said Flavel. "Are you going to stand there and say you never saw me last year, walk through those woods with Mrs. De Winter and go into the cottage? Didn't we catch you once peering at us from the window?" "Eh?" said Ben. "A convincing witness," said Colonel Julien sarcastically. Flavel swung around on him. "It's a put-up job," he said. "Someone has got at this idiot and bribed him too. I tell you, he's seen me scores of times. Here, will this make you remember?" He fumbled in his hip pocket and brought out a note case. He flourished a £1 note in front of Ben. "Now, do you remember me?" he said. Ben shook his head. "I never seen un," he said. And then he took hold of Frank's arm. "Has he come here to take me to the asylum?" "No," said Frank. "No, of course not, Ben." "I don't want to go to the asylum," said Ben. "Them cruel to folk in there. I want to stay home. I done nothing." "That's all right, Ben," said Colonel Julien. "No one's going to put you in the asylum. Are you quite sure you've never seen this man before?" "No, I never seen him," said Ben. "You remember Mrs. De Winter, don't you?" said Colonel Julien. Ben glanced doubtfully toward me. "No," said Colonel Julien gently. "Not this lady. The other lady, who used to go to the cottage." "Eh?" said Ben. "You remember the lady who had the boat?" Ben blinked his eyes. "She's gone," he said. "Yes, we know that," said Colonel Julien. "She used to sail the boat, didn't she? When you were on the beach, when she sailed the boat last time? One evening, over 12 months ago. When she didn't come back again." Ben twisted his sou'wester. He glanced at Frank and then at Maxim. "Eh?" he said. "You were there, weren't you?" said Flavel, leaning forward. "You saw Mrs. De Winter come down to the cottage, and presently you saw Mr. De Winter too. He went in the cottage after her. What happened then? Go on, what happened?" Ben shrank against the wall. "I seen nothing," he said. "I want to stay home. I'm not going to the asylum. I never seen you, never before. I never seen you and she in the woods." He began to blubber like a child. "You crazy little rat," said Flavel slowly. "You bloody crazy little rat." Ben was wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his coat. "Your witness does not seem to have helped you," said Colonel Julien. "The performance has been a rather waste of time, hasn't it? Do you want to ask him anything else?" "It's a plot," shouted Flavel. "A plot against me. You're all in it, every one of you. Someone's paid this half-wit, I tell you, paid him to tell his string of dirty lies." "I think Ben might be allowed to go home," said Colonel Julien. "All right, Ben," said Maxim. "Robert shall take you back, and no one will put you in the asylum. Don't be afraid. Tell Robert to find him something in the kitchen," he added to Frank. "Some cold meat, whatever he fancies." "Payment for services rendered, eh?" said Flavel. "He's done a good day's work for you, Max, hasn't he?" Frank took Ben out of the room. Colonel Julien glanced at Maxim. "The fellow appeared to be scared stiff," he said. "He was shaking like a leaf. I was watching him. He's never been ill-treated, has he?" No, said Maxim. He's perfectly harmless, and I've always let him have the run of the place. He's been frightened at some time, said Colonel Julian. He's showing the whites of his eyes, just like a dog does when you're going to whip him. Well, why didn't you? Said Flavel. He'd have remembered me all right if you'd whipped him. Oh, no, he's going to be given a good supper for his work tonight. Ben's not going to be whipped. He has not helped your case, has he? Said Colonel Julian quietly. We are still where we were. You can't produce one shred of evidence against De Winter, and you know it. The very motive you gave won't stand the test. In a court of law, Flavel, you wouldn't have a leg to stand on. You say you were Mrs. De Winter's prospective husband, and that you held clandestine meetings with her in that cottage on the beach. Even the poor idiot we have just seen in this room swears he never saw you. You can't even prove your own story, can you? Can't I? Said Flavel. I saw him smile. He came across to the fireplace and rang the bell. What are you doing? Said Colonel Julian. Wait a minute and you'll see, said Flavel. I guessed already what was going to happen. Frith answered the bell. Ask Mrs. Danvers to come here, said Flavel. Frith glanced at Maxim. Maxim nodded shortly. Frith went out of the room. Isn't Mrs. Danvers the housekeeper? Said Colonel Julian. She was also Rebecca's personal friend, said Flavel. She was with her for years before she married and practically brought her up. You're going to find Danny a very different sort of witness to Ben. Frank came back into the room. Packed Ben off to bed, said Flavel, given him his supper and told him he's a good boy. This time it won't be quite so easy for the trades union. Mrs. Danvers is coming down, said Colonel Julian. Flavel seems to think he will get something out of her. Frank glanced quickly at Maxim. Colonel Julian saw the glance. I saw his lips tighten, and I did not like it. No, I did not like it at all. I began biting my nails. We all waited, watching the door, and when Mrs. Danvers came into the room. Perhaps it was because I had generally seen her alone, and beside me she had seemed tall and gaunt, but she looked shrunken now in size, more Wisden, and I noticed she had to look up to Flavel and to Frank and Maxim. She stood by the door, her hands folded in front of her, looking from one to the other of us. Good evening, Mrs. Danvers, said Colonel Julian. Good evening, sir, she said. Her voice was that old, dead, mechanical one I had heard so often. First of all, Mrs. Danvers, I want to ask you a question, said Colonel Julian, and the question is this. Were you aware of the relationship between the late Mrs. De Winter and Mr. Flavel here? They were first cousins, said Mrs. Danvers. I was not referring to a blood relationship, Mrs. Danvers, said Colonel Julian. I mean something closer than that. I'm afraid I don't understand, sir, said Mrs. Danvers. Oh, come off it, Danny, said Flavel. You know damn well what he's driving at. I've told Colonel Julian already, but he doesn't seem to believe me. Rebecca and I had lived together off and on for years, hadn't we? She was in love with me, wasn't she? To my surprise, Mrs. Danvers considered him for a moment without speaking. There was something of scorn in the glance she gave him. She was not, she said. Listen here, you old fool, began Flavel, but Mrs. Danvers cut him short. She was not in love with you or with Mr. De Winter. She was not in love with anyone. She despised all men. She was above all that. Flavel flushed angrily. Listen here. Didn't she come down the path through the woods to meet me, night after night? Didn't you wait up for her? Didn't she spend the weekends with me in London? Well, said Mrs. Danvers with sudden passion, and what if she did? She had a right to amuse herself, didn't she? Love-making was a game with her, only a game. She told me so. She did it because it made her laugh. It made her laugh, I tell you. She laughed at you like she did the rest. I've known her to come back and sit upstairs on her bed and rock with laughter at the lot of you. There was something horrible in the sudden torrent of words, something horrible and unexpected. It revolted me, even though I knew. Maxim had gone very white. Flavel stared at her blankly, as though he had not understood. Colonel Julian tugged at his small mustache. No one said anything for a few minutes, and there was no sound but that inevitable falling rain. Then Mrs. Danvers began to cry. She cried like she had done that morning in the bedroom. I could not look at her. I had to turn away, and no one said anything. There were just two sounds in the room, the falling rain and Mrs. Danvers crying, and it made me want to scream. I wanted to run out of the room and scream and scream. No one moved towards her to say anything or to help her. She went on crying. Then at last, it seemed eternity, she began to control herself. Little by little, the crying ceased. She stood quite still, her face working, her hands clutching the black stuff of her frock. At last, she was silent again. Then Colonel Julian spoke quietly, slowly. Mrs. Danvers, he said, can you think of any reason, however remote, why Mrs. De Winter should have taken her own life? Mrs. Danvers swallowed. She went on clutching at her frock. She shook her head. No, she said. No. There, you see, said Flavel quickly. It's impossible. She knows that as well as I do, and I've told you already. Be quiet, will you? Said Colonel Julian. Give Mrs. Danvers time to think. We all of us agree that on the face of this thing's absurd, out of the question. I'm not disputing the truth or veracity of that note of yours. It's plain for us to see. She wrote you that note sometime during those hours she spent in London. There was something she wanted to tell you. It's just possible that if we knew what that something was, we might have an answer to the whole appalling problem. Let Mrs. Danvers read the note. She may be able to throw light on it. Flavel shrugged his shoulders. He felt in his pocket for the note and threw it on the floor at Mrs. Danvers' feet. She stooped and picked it up. We watched her lips move as she read the words. She read it twice, then she shook her head. It's no use, she said. I don't know what she meant. If there was something important she had to tell Mr. Jack, she would have told me first. You never saw her that night? No, I was out. I was spending the afternoon and evening in Kerrith. I shall never forgive myself for that. Never till my dying day. Then you know nothing on her mind. You can't suggest a solution, Mr. Danvers? Those words, I have something to tell you, do not convey anything to you at all? No, she answered. No, sir, nothing at all. Does anybody know how she spent that day in London? Nobody answered. Maxim shook his head. Flavel swore under his breath. Look here, she left that note in my flat at 3 p.m, he said. The porter saw her. She must have driven down here straight after that and gone like the wind, too. Mrs. De Winter had a hair appointment from 12 until 1:30, said Mrs. Danvers. I remember that because I had to telephone through to London from here earlier in the week and book it for her. I remember doing it. 12 to 1:30. She always lunched at her club after a hair appointment so that she could leave the pins in her hair. It's almost certain she lunched there that day. Say it took her half an hour to have lunch. What was she doing from 2 until 3? We ought to verify that, said Colonel Julian. Oh, Jesus Christ, who the hell cares what she was doing? Shouted Flavel. She didn't kill herself. That's the only bloody thing that matters, isn't it? I've got her engagement diary locked in my room, said Mrs. Danvers slowly. I keep all those things. Mr. De Winter never asked me for them. It's just possible she may have noted down her appointment for that day. She was methodical in that way. She used to put everything down and then tick the items off with a cross. Do you think it would be helpful if I go and fetch the diary? Well, Mr. De Winter, said Colonel Julian, what do you say? Do you mind us seeing this diary? Of course not, said Maxim. Why on earth should I? Once again, I saw Colonel Julian give him that swift, curious glance, and this time Frank noticed it. I saw Frank look at Maxim too, and then back to me. This time it was I who got up and went towards the window. It seemed to me it was not raining so hard, and it was no longer raining quite so hard. The fury was spent. The rain that was falling now had a quieter, softer note. The gray light of the evening had come into the sky. The lawns were dark and drenched with the heavy rain, and the trees had a shrouded, humped appearance. I could hear the housemaid overhead drawing the curtains for the night, shutting down the windows that had not been closed already. The little routine of the day going on inevitably as it has always done. The curtains drawn, shoes taken down to be clean, the towel laid out on the chair in the bathroom, and the water run from my bath. Beds turned down, slippers put beneath a chair. And here we were in the library, none of us speaking, knowing in our hearts that Maxim was standing trial here for his life. I turned around when I heard the soft closing of the door. It was Mrs. Danvers. She had come back again with the diary in her hand. I was right, she said quietly. She had marked down the engagements as I said she would. Here they are on the date she died. She opened the diary, a small red leather book. She gave it to Colonel Julian. Once more he brought his spectacles from his case. There was a long pause while he glanced down the page. It seemed to me then that there was something about that particular movement, while he looked at the page of the diary and we stood waiting, that frightened me more than anything that had happened that evening. I dug my nails into my hands. I could not look at Maxim. Surely Colonel Julian must hear my heart beating and thumping in my breast. Ah, he said. His finger was in the middle of the page. Something is going to happen. I thought something terrible is going to happen. Yes, he said. Yes, here it is. Hair at 12, as Mrs. Danvers said, and a cross beside it. She kept her appointment then. Lunch at the club and a cross beside that. What have we here, though? Baker, 2 o'clock. Who is Baker? He looked at Maxim. Maxim shook his head. Then he looked at Mrs. Danvers. Baker, repeated Mrs. Danvers. She knew no one called Baker. I have never heard the name before. Well, here it is, said Julian, handing her the diary. You can see for yourself. Baker. And she's put a great cross beside it, as though she wanted to break the pencil. She evidently saw this Baker, and whoever he may have been. Mrs. Danvers was staring at the black name written in the diary and the black cross beside it. Baker, she said. Baker. I believe if we knew who Baker was, we'd be getting into the bottom of this whole business. She wasn't in the hand of moneylenders, was she? Said Colonel Julian. Mrs. Danvers looked at him with scorn. Mrs. De Winter? She said. Well, blackmailers, perhaps, said Colonel Julian, with a glance at Fauvel. Mrs. Danvers shook her head. Baker, she repeated. Baker. She had no enemy, no one who has ever threatened her, no one she was afraid of. Mrs. De Winter afraid? Said Mrs. Danvers. She was afraid of nothing and no one. There was only one thing that ever worried her, and that was the idea of getting old, of illness, of dying in her bed. She said to me scores of times, when I go, Danny, I want to go quickly, like the snuffing out of a candle. That used to be the only thing that consoled me after she died. They say drowning is painless, don't they? She looked searchingly at Colonel Julian. He did not answer. He hesitated, tugging at his mustache. I saw him throw another glance at Maxim. What the hell's the use of all of this? Said Fauvel, coming forward. We're streaking away from the point of the whole bloody time. Who cares about this Baker fellow? What's he got to do with it? It was probably some damn merchant who sold stockings or face cream. If he had been anything important, Danny here would have known him. Rebecca had no secrets from Danny. But I was watching Mrs. Danvers. She had the book in her hand and was turning the leaves. Suddenly, she gave an exclamation. There's something here, she said, right at the back among the telephone numbers. Baker. And there's a number beside it, 0488, but there is no exchange. Brilliant, Danny, said Fauvel, becoming quite a sleuth in your old age, aren't you? But you're just 12 months too late. If you'd have done this a year ago, there might have been some use in it. That's his number, all right, said Colonel Julian. 0488, and the name Baker beside it. Why didn't she put the exchange? Try every exchange in London, jeered Fauvel. It will take you through the night, but we don't mind. Maxim doesn't care if his telephone bill is £100, do you, Max? You want to pay for time, and so should I, if I were in your shoes. There's a mark beside the number, but it might mean anything, said Colonel Julian. Take a look at it, Mrs. Danvers. Could it possibly be an M? Mrs. Danvers took the diary in her hands again. It might be, she said doubtfully. It's not her usual M, but she may have scribbled it in a hurry. Yes, it might be an M. Mayfair 0488, said Fauvel. What a genius! What a brain! Well, said Maxim, lighting his first cigarette, something had better be done about it. Frank, go through and ask the exchange for Mayfair 0488. The nagging pain was strong beneath my heart. I stood quite still, my hands by my side. Maxim did not look at me. Go on, Frank. What are you waiting for? Frank went through to the little room beyond. We waited while he called the exchange. In a moment, he was back again. They are going to ring me, he said quietly. Colonel Julian clasped his hands behind his back and began walking up and down the room. No one said anything. After about 4 minutes, the telephone rang shrill and insistent, that irritating, monotonous tone of a long-distance call. Frank went through to answer it. Is that Mayfair 0488? He said. Can you tell me if anyone by the name of Baker lives there? Oh, I see. I am so sorry. Yes, I must have gotten the wrong number. Thank you very much. The little click as he replaced the receiver, then he came back into the room. Someone called Lady Eastley lives at Mayfair 0488. It is an address in Grosvenor Street. They've never heard of Baker. Flavel gave a great cackle of laughter. The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, they all jumped out of a rotten potato, he said. Carry on, Detective Number 1. What's the next exchange on the list? Try museum, said Mrs. Danvers. Frank glanced at Maxim. Go ahead, said Maxim. This farce was repeated all over again. Colonel Julian repeated his walk up and down the room. Another 5 minutes went by and the telephone rang again. Frank went to answer it. He left the door wide open. I could see him lean down to the table where the telephone stood and bend to the mouthpiece. Hello, is that Museum 0488? Can you tell me if anyone by the name of Baker lives there? Oh, who is that speaking? A night porter. Yes. Yes, I understand. Not offices. No, of course. Can you give me the address? Yes, it's rather important. He paused. He called to us over his shoulder. I think we've got him, he said. Oh, God, don't let it be true. Don't let Baker be found. Please, God, make Baker be dead. Because I knew who Baker was. I had known all along. I watched Frank through the door. I watched him lean forward suddenly, reach for a pencil and a piece of paper. Hello? Yes, I'm still here. Could you spell it? Thank you very much. Good night. He came back into the room, the piece of paper in his hands. Frank, who loved Maxim, who did not know that the piece of paper he held was the one shred of evidence that was worth a damn in the whole nightmare of our evening, and that by producing it, he could destroy Maxim as well, and truly, as though he had a dagger in his hand and stabbed him in the back. It was the night porter from an address in Bloomsbury, he said. There are no residents there. The place is used during the day as a doctor's consulting rooms. Apparently, Baker's given up practice and left 6 months ago, but we can get a hold of him all right. The night porter gave me his address. I wrote it down on this piece of paper. It was then that Maxim looked at me. He looked at me for the first time that evening, and in his eyes I read the message of farewell. It was as though he leant against the side of a ship, and I stood below him in the quay. There would be other people touching his shoulder and touching mine, but we would not see them. Nor would we speak or call to one another, for the wind and the distance would carry away the sound of our voices. But I should see his eyes, and he should see mine before the ship drew away from the side of the quay. Flavel, Mrs. Danvers, Colonel Julian, Frank, with the slip of paper in his hands, they were all forgotten at this moment. It was hours, and Violet, a fraction of time suspended between 2 seconds. And then he turned away and held out his hand to Frank. Well done, he said. What's the address? Somewhere near Bartnet, north of London, said Frank, giving him the paper. But it's not on the telephone. We can't ring him up. Satisfactory work, Crawley, said Colonel Julian, and from you too, Mrs. Danvers. Can you throw any light on the matter now? Mrs. Danvers shook her head. Mrs. De Winter never needed a doctor. Like all strong people, she despised them. We only had Dr. Phillips from Carith here once, that time she sprained her wrist. I've never heard her speak of Dr. Baker. She never mentioned that name to me. I tell you the fellow was a face cream mixer, said Flavel. What the hell does it matter who he was? If there was anything to do, If there was anything to it, Danny would know. I tell you, it's some fool fellow who had discovered a new way of bleaching her hair or whitening the skin, and Rebecca had probably got the address from her hairdresser that morning and went along to lunch out of curiosity. No, said Frank, I think you're wrong there. Baker wasn't a quack. The night porter at Museum 0488 told me he was a very well-known woman's specialist. Said Colonel Julian, pulling at his mustache. There must have been something wrong with her after all. Seems very curious that she did not say a word to anybody, not even you, Mrs. Danvers. She was too thin, said Flavel. I told her about it, but she only laughed, said it suited her. Banting, I suppose, like all these women. Perhaps she went to this chap Baker for a diet sheet. Do you think that's possible, Mrs. Danvers? Said Colonel Julian. Mrs. Danvers shook her head slowly. She seemed dazed, bewildered by this sudden news about Baker. I can't understand it, she said. I don't know what it means. Baker, a Dr. Baker. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she keep it from me? She told me everything. Perhaps she didn't want to worry you, said Colonel Julian. No doubt she made an appointment with him and saw him, and then when she came down that night, she was going to have told you all about it. And the note to Mr. Jack, said Mrs. Danvers suddenly. That note to Mr. Jack. I have something to tell you. I must see you. She's going to tell him too? That is true, said Flavel slowly. We were forgetting the note. Once more he pulled it out of his pocket and read it to us aloud. I've got something to tell you. I want to see you as soon as possible. Rebecca. Of course, there's no doubt about it, said Colonel Julian, turning to Maxim. I wouldn't mind betting £1,000 on it. She was going to tell Flavel the result of that interview with this Dr. Baker. I believe you're right after all, said Flavel. The note and this appointment seem to hang together. But what the hell was it all about? That's what I want to know. What was the matter with her? The truth screamed in their faces, and they did not see. They all stood there, staring at one another, and they did not understand. I dare not look at them. I dared not move lest I betray my knowledge. Maxim said nothing. He had gone back to the window and was looking out into the garden that was hushed and dark and still. The rain had ceased at last, but the spots fell from the dripping leaves and from the gutter above the window. It ought to be quite easy to verify, said Frank. Here is the doctor's present address. I can write him a letter and ask him if he remembers an appointment last year with Mrs. De Winter. I don't know if he would make much notice of it, said Colonel Julian. There's so much of this etiquette in the medical profession. Every case is confidential, you know. The only way to get anything out of him would be to get De Winter to see him privately and explain the circumstances. What do you say, De Winter? Maxim turned from the window. I'm ready to do whatever you care to suggest, he said quietly. Anything for time, eh? Said Flavel. A lot can be done in 24 hours, can't it? Trains can be taught. Ships can sail. Aeroplanes can fly. I saw Mrs. Danvers look sharply from Flavel to Maxim, and I realized then for the first time that Mrs. Danvers had not known about Flavel's accusation. At last she was beginning to understand. I could tell from the expression on her face. There was doubt written on it, then wonder and hatred mixed, and then conviction. Once again, those lean, long hands of hers clutched convulsively at her dress, and she passed her tongue over her lips. She went on staring at Maxim. She never took her eyes away from Maxim. It's too late. I thought she can't do anything to us now. The harm is done. It does not matter what she says to us now or what she does. The harm is done. She can't hurt us any more. Maxim did not notice her, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was talking to Colonel Julian. What do you suggest? He said. Shall I go up in the morning, drive to this address in Barnet? I can wire Baker to expect me. He's not going alone, said Flavel with a short laugh. I have a right to insist on that, haven't I? Sending him up with Inspector Welch, and I won't object. If only Mrs. Danvers could take her eyes away from Maxim. Frank had seen her now. He was watching her, puzzled, anxious. I saw him glance one more at the slip of papers in his hand on which he had written Dr. Baker's address. Then he, too, glanced at Maxim. I believe then that some faint idea of the truth began to force itself into his consciousness, for he went very white and put the paper down on the table. I don't think there is any necessity to bringing Inspector Welch into the affair, yet, said Colonel Julian. His voice was different, harsher. I did not like the way he used the word yet. Why must he use it at all? I did not like it. If I go with De Winter and stay with him the whole time and bring him back, will that satisfy you? He said. Flavel looked at Maxim and then at Colonel Julian. The expression on his face was ugly, calculating, and there was something of triumph, too, in his light blue eyes. Yes, he said slowly. Yes, I suppose so. But for safety's sake, do you mind if I come with you, too? No, said Colonel Julian. Unfortunately, I think you have the right to ask that, but if you do come, I have the right to insist on your being sober. You don't need to worry about that, said Flavel, beginning to smile. I'll be sober, all right. Sober as the judge will be when he sentences Max to 3 months' time. I rather think this Dr. Baker is going to prove my case after all. He looked around at each of us and began to laugh. I think he, too, had understood at last the significance of that visit to the doctor. Well, what time are we going to start in the morning? Colonel Julian looked at Maxim. How early can you be ready? Any time you say, said Maxim. 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock, said Maxim. How do we know we won't do a bolt in the night? Said Flavel. He always got to cut around to the garage and get his car. Is my word enough for you? Said Maxim, turning to Colonel Julian, and for the first time, Colonel Julian hesitated. I saw him glance at Frank, and a flush came over Maxim's face. I saw the little pulse beating at his forehead. Mrs. Danvers, he said slowly, when Mrs. De Winter and I go to bed tonight, will you come yourself and lock the door on the outside and call us yourself at 7 in the morning? Yes, sir, said Mrs. Danvers. Still she kept her eyes on him. Still her hands clutched at her dress. Very well, then, said Colonel Julian brusquely. I don't think there's anything else we need to discuss tonight. I shall be here tomorrow, sharp at 9 in the morning. You will have room for me in your car, De Winter? Yes, said Maxim. And Flavel will follow us in his. Right on your tail, my dear fellow, right on your tail, said Flavel. Colonel Julian came up to me and took my hand. Good night, he said. You know how I feel for you in all this. There's no need for me to tell you. Get your husband to bed early, if you can. It's going to be a long day. He held my hand a minute, and then he turned away. It was curious how he avoided my eye. He looked at my chin. Frank held the door for him as he went out. Flavel leant forward and filled his case with cigarettes from the box on the table. Suppose I'm not going to be asked to stop to dinner, he said. Nobody answered. He lit one of the cigarettes and blew a cloud of smoke into the air. Means a quiet evening at the pub on the high road, then, he said, and then the barmaid has a squint. Hell of a night I'm going to spend. Never mind, I'm looking forward to tomorrow. Good night, Danny, old lady, and don't forget to turn the key on Mr. De Winter, will you? He came over to me and held out his hand. Like a foolish child, I put my hands behind my back. He laughed and bowed. Just too bad, isn't it? He said. A nasty man like me coming and spoiling all your fun. Don't worry, it will be a great thrill for you when the yellow press gets along with your life story, and you see the headlines. From Monte Carlo to Manderley. Experiences of a murderer's girl bride, written across the top. Better luck next time. He strolled across the room to the door, waving his hand to Maxim by the window. So long, old man. Pleasant dreams. Make the most of your night behind that locked door. He turned and laughed at me. Then he went out of the room. Mrs. Danvers followed him, and Maxim and I were alone. He was standing by the window. He had not come to me. Jasper came trotting in from the hall. He'd been shut outside all evening. He came fussing up to me, biting the edge of my skirt. I'm coming with you in the morning, I said to Maxim. I'm coming to London with you in the car. He did not answer for a moment. He went on looking out the window. Then, yes, he said, his voice without expression. Yes, we must go on being together. Frank came back into the room. He stood at the entrance, his hand on the door. They've gone, he said. Flavel and Colonel Julian. I watched them go. All right, Frank, said Maxim. Is there anything I can do? Said Frank. Anything at all. Wire to anyone, arrange anything. I'll stay up all night if only there's anything I can do. I'll get that wire off to Baker, of course. Don't worry, said Maxim. There is nothing for you to do. yet. There may be plenty after tomorrow. We can go to all that when the time comes. Tonight we want to be together. You understand, don't you?" "Yes," said Frank. "Yes, of course." He waited a moment, his hand on the door. "Good night," he said. "Good night," said Maxim. When he had gone and shut the door behind him, Maxim came over to me where I was standing by the fireplace. I held out my arms to him, and he came to me like a child. I put my arms around him and held him. We did not say anything for a long time. I held him and comforted him as though he were Jasper, as though Jasper had hurt himself in some way and had come to me to take his pain away. "We can sit together driving up in the car?" "Yes," I said. "Julian won't mind," he said. "No," I said. "We shall have tomorrow night, too. They won't do anything at once, not for 24 hours, perhaps." "No," I said. "They aren't so strict now," he said. They let one see people. It all takes such a long time. If I can, I shall try and get a hold of Hastings. He's the best. Hastings or Burkett. Hastings used to know my father." "Yes," I said. "I shall have to tell him the truth," he said. "It makes it easier for them. They know where they are." "Yes," I said. The door opened and Frith came into the room. I pushed Maxim away. I stood up straight and conventional, patting my hair into place. "Will you be changing, madam, or shall I serve dinner at once?" "No, Frith, we won't be changing. Not tonight," I said. "Very good, madam," he said. He left the door open. Robert came in and began drawing the curtains. He arranged the cushions, straightened the sofa, tidied the books and papers on the table. He took away the whiskey and soda and the dirty ashtrays. I had seen him do these things as a ritual every evening I had spent at Manderley, but tonight they seemed to take on a special significance, as though the memory of them would last forever, and I should say long after, to some other time. I remember this moment. Then Frith came in and told us that dinner was served. I remember every detail of that evening. I remember the ice-cold consommé in the cups, and the fillet of sole, and the hot shoulder of lamb. I remember the burnt sugar sweet, the sharp savory that followed. We had new candles in the silver candlesticks, and they looked white and slim and very tall. The curtains had been drawn here, too, against the dull gray evening. It seemed strange to be sitting in the dining room and not look out onto the lawns. It was like the beginning of autumn. It was while we were drinking our coffee in the library that the telephone rang. This time it was I who answered it. I heard Beatrice speaking at the other end. "Is that you?" she said. "I've been trying to get through all evening. Twice it was engaged." "I'm sorry," I said, "so very sorry." "We had the evening papers about 2 hours ago," she said, "and the verdict was a frightful shock to both Giles and myself. What does Maxim say about it?" "I think it was a shock to everybody," I said. "But, my dear, the thing is preposterous. Why on earth should Rebecca have committed suicide? The most unlikely person in the world. There must have been a blunder somewhere." "I don't know," I said. "What does Maxim say? Where is he?" she said. "People have been here," I said. "Colonel Julian and others. Maxim is very tired. We're going up to London tomorrow." "What on earth for?" "Something to do with the verdict. I can't very well explain." "You ought to get it squashed," she said. "It's ridiculous, quite ridiculous. And so bad for Maxim, all this frightful publicity. It's going to reflect on him." "Yes," I said. "Surely Colonel Julian can do something," she said. "He's a magistrate. What are magistrates for? Old Horridge from Landon must have been off his head. What was her motive supposed to be? It is the most idiotic thing I have ever heard in my life. Someone ought to get a hold of Tab. How can he tell whether those holes in the boat were made deliberately or not? Giles said, of course, it must have been the rocks." "They seem to think not," I said. "If only I could have been there," she said. "I should have insisted on speaking. No one seems to have made any effort. Is Maxim very upset?" "He's tired," I said, "more tired than anything." "I wish I could come to London and join you," she said, "but I don't see how I can. Roger has a temperature of 103, poor old boy, and the nurse we've got on is a perfect idiot. He loathes her. I can't possibly leave him." "Of course not," I said. "You mustn't attempt it." "Where about in London's will you be?" "I don't know. It's all rather vague," I said. "Tell Maxim he must try and do something to get that verdict altered. It's so bad for the family. I'm telling everybody here it's absolutely wicked. Rebecca would never have killed herself. She wasn't the type. I have a good mind to write to the coroner myself." "It's too late," I said. Much better leave it. It won't do any good. The stupidity of it gets my goat, she said. Giles and I think it much more likely that if those holes weren't done by the rocks, they were done deliberately by some tramp or other. A communist, perhaps. There are heaps of them about. Just the sort of thing a communist would do. Maxim called me in from the library. Can't you get rid of her? What on earth is she talking about? Beatrice, I said desperately, I'll try and ring you up from London. Is it any good my tackling Dick Golfin? She said. He's your MP. I know him very well, much better than Maxim does. He was at Oxford with Giles. Ask Maxim whether he would like me to telephone Dick and see if he can come do anything to squash the verdict. Ask Maxim what he thinks of this communist idea. It's no use, I said. It can't do any good. Please, Beatrice, don't try and do anything. It'll make it worse, much worse. Rebecca may have had some motive we don't know anything about, and I don't think communists go ramming holes in boats. What would be the use? Please, Beatrice, leave it alone. Thank God she had not been with us today. Thank God for that, at least. Something was buzzing in the telephone, and I heard Beatrice shouting, Hello? Hello, don't cut us off. Exchange! And then there was a click and silence. I went back to the library, limp and exhausted. In a few minutes, the telephone began ringing again. I did not do anything. I let it ring. I went and sat down at Maxim's feet. It went on ringing. I did not move. Presently it stopped, as though cut suddenly off in exasperation. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10 o'clock. Maxim put his arms around me and lifted me against him. We began to kiss one another, feverishly, desperately, like guilty lovers who have not kissed before. There we have it. Yes, faithful Jasper. Jasper, oh, I love dogs. But there we go. There we have it. 2 more chapters, which we will finish the next time. This itty little bit of room. Well, so we know, if you weren't with us last time, Rebecca was pregnant, but she didn't know, and she was pretty sure it was Flavel's because she and Maxim hadn't been together because their marriage was terrible. So she was carrying Flavel's baby. She went to get it discovered and confirmed by Dr. Baker, and Flavel, I think, is starting to put the pieces together, as is everybody. And we'll see. We'll see. So next time, yes, wow is right. Next time we will finish Rebecca. And if there's time, we'll chat a little bit about it. But we will see what happens to all of our people. I'm more just impressed with how calm Maxim is, which makes me think he has something planned. Makes me think that something's going to go down next time. So I will see you next time. We will finish off this book. Thank you for sticking it out, hanging out with me all of these weeks. And I hope you have a great day. I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.